Right, my name is Peggy Vroman Gracie. Today is March 19th, 2009. I'm sitting in my parents' living room in Trinity Terrace in Fort Worth, and I'm going to start my oral history of my family with them. So,
Well, I'm her father, I suppose. My name is Leo Vroman. I was born in Gouda, which you would pronounce Gouda, where the cheese comes from. It's Gouda in the Netherlands. I was born April 1915. My parents were Jewish, so I call myself Jewish, but neither my parents nor I did much about it until the war broke out, actually.
My name is officially Georgine Marie Sanders, and I was always called Tineke for short. I was born in Indonesia, which in those days was still a colony of Holland and was called the Dutch East Indies. In 1921, I was born in Padang of the island of Sumatra.
and your actual birthday was March 4th, 1921?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, and Dad, yours is
April
April 10th,
10th,
1915.
Right.
Okay. And so if you could share a little bit about your childhood and
I think, as is the case with most children, my first memory is when I was 3 years old. I found myself sitting in the sandbox, and I saw my legs and realized they were mine. My father was a physics teacher. My mother was a math teacher. So, and my brother Jaap, who was more than 2 years older than I was, later, of course, became a geologist. I much later became a biologist. But we were really educated in a hard science atmosphere. Well, not hard in emotionally, but hard in thinking. I did my bar mitzvah when I was 13, which is the only Jewish thing I remember having done. She disagrees, what?
Well, you forget the first thing that happened to you.
The first thing that happened, I was circumcised.
That's right.
Well, I didn't realize until much later. We had token Jewish things. We had a menorah standing way on top of a bookcase in our study that we never touched. And had my bar mitzvah in a big Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam, of which I only remember wearing a hat that was too large for me. I remember little of my very early youth, of course, but there were traditions unrelated almost to religion. Those were the vacations we had from elementary school until including high school. There was Easter vacation, there was a Pentecost vacation, which may be important later, and there were Christmas vacations. And we Jewish kids celebrated all of them. And we painted eggs on Easter vacation. We went to Amsterdam for Christmas vacation, but then stayed with more Jewish conscious families, I think, in Amsterdam.
but you had an uncle who was the chief rabbi of Gouda, or
Yeah, well, a rather distant uncle, but Yes.
And was so the lack of religious celebrations in your family, was that pretty typical of many of the Jewish families in Holland at that time?
Especially in little towns like Gouda, I think my parents also felt they didn't want to stand out that way. But on the other hand, I later realized my father was often described as the Jew. We're having the Jew at 4 o'clock or something.
So there was some stigma to being Jewish
Yes.
in Holland then, yeah.
Yeah, and well, because of my big nose, as you can see, especially that way, my kids would run behind me and say, "Hey, big nose, hey, Jew nose," that sort of thing.
Mhm.
But it didn't affect me,
Mhm.
I think.
Yeah.
Well, when I went from elementary school, where my best friend was Bertus, a cousin who later disappeared during the German occupation. Then I got to the high school, which was down the street where we lived, and it is now named after me. And it was so close that for breaks, my father and I and one or two students would run home, and my mother would have coffee ready or chocolate. And of course, for lunch we went home. My father would sit in a chair, read himself to sleep with a mystery that he had memorized. He could quote from it. He couldn't quote from much else.
How about any music lessons, arts,
Oh.
things that were sort of expected of young, educated families in those
Yes,
days?
I had piano lessons that I approached the same way as I approached the lessons for learning Hebrew and getting my bar mitzvah. A relief after the last lesson and never go back to it again. I hated to hear myself play the piano as much as I hated to hear myself try to talk Hebrew.
Did your parents play piano and your brother? Or
My brother criticized
Oh.
piano playing. My mother played the piano and my father sang. My father often said he had dreamt of marrying a girl that could sing and had blue eyes. My mother had very dark eyes and couldn't sing a note. But she played the piano pretty well. I myself wanted a harp so much so that when nobody was home, I opened the top of the piano and put my foot on the pedal so I could pluck the strings inside the piano. Sounded pretty good.
Yeah.
I had a very good friend in high school, and I fell in love with a girl I once saw sitting on a podium during a school party. Never talked to her, but I found out her name, and my friend knew her. So I wrote this in a diary about 60 years later, and my friend, still being alive, read it, and I wrote that this girl was the daughter of a veterinary man, and that was wrong. So he went to her, she was still alive, and this was the first time that I ever corresponded or even talked to her over the phone. To refresh my memory, she sent me a picture of her when she was 70. It didn't help very much.
Now, I mean, your career later on obviously is a very interesting mix of science and art. Did you, from when you were very young, did you have an interest in nature and biology and art and try to find some way to bring those together?
I had a love for animals that was probably not normal. I still remember picking up a worm, and the worm was so cute it tried to dig itself between my fingers, and I asked my mother's permission to kiss it, and she did not give me permission, so I went back in the garden and kissed it there and then set it free. They were under the bricks that I could lift in front of the house. There were little salamanders that I sometimes put in our aquarium, from which they escaped and dried up somewhere in the corner of the room. But I loved all living things, but mostly animals, like cat, of course.
Mm-hmm.
I was allowed to kiss the cat, I think.
And did your interest in drawing and,
In drawing,
art go with that, or?
I did kind of very strange things. I started drawing when I was 3 or 4, and I drew puzzles for my mother to solve. She must have been very patient on it. I remember I drew a square and then 4 straight things and some stuff, 4 things like that, and she had to guess what it was. And it was a table with legs and just shadows of the legs. She had to put it together in her mind.
Some assembly required?
I drew, I remember drawing, I was in love with Africa, so I drew elephants in a circle, sucking up water and blowing out a fire, and stuff like that.
Now, could you explain a little bit about the school system there, that because it is so very different from what we have in the States, but what the grades were and college, university?
Yes, the elementary school had grades from 0 to 10, I think. As a matter of fact, I once made a 0. I was a little late coming into the class, and my cousin Bertus was already sitting there, so I decided to sit next to him, which was not the way to behave, but it was allowed. And Bertus had a trimmer, and the task was to make diagonals in little squares, and his came out rather zigzag, so I realized I could make much better zigzags than he did. So I thought this square was, well, spectacular zigzags, and got a 0.
What was it supposed to be?
Straight lines.
Oh.
So that we had 6 grades. Then many kids went to high school. There were 2 kinds of high school. One was called the HBS, Hogere Burgerschool, HBS,
Mm-hmm.
which was science-oriented, and there was a gymnasium which was language-oriented and required Latin and Greek. My father was physics teacher in both schools. My brother went to the gymnasium, which was alongside a canal, and which my brother used to fall in once. So we had different mindsets a little bit.
And after, but you went to gymnasium or?
No, I went to the
HBS?
HBS,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the one named after me a couple of years ago. It was, well, we learned, of course, French already in the last class of elementary school. Then in the 1st grade high school we learned German, and in the 2nd grade we started English. And the final exams, which were also pretty different from here, consisted of oral and written. Some subjects were only oral, like history and geography, and I was not good in history. I remember my final exam, which is done by teachers but associated with a professor invited from somewhere to check up. We talked about some event, and my teacher, who was also the head of the school, I said, under which king was that? So quickly thinking, as always, I said, well, there must have been about 8 Willems. I picked the middle Willem, which is Willem the fourth. So I said, well, the fourth. And he turned purple because there were only 3 of them.
So,
But I got pretty high marks, and my parents did push me really to make high marks, which did not happen to Tineke. But, well, you hear from her how she made out.
and then, so after the HBS, then was that, from there you went to Utrecht?
Yeah, my brother was already there
Mm-hmm.
Studying geology, and so it was logical for me to go there and also become a member of the same club he was a member of.
And was that then equivalent of what would be an undergraduate?
The candidates exam was, well, it's close to bachelor, a little more advanced.
And candidaats was when you finished
That is after about 3 years.
at
study.
Utrecht?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And I was ready for what you would call a doctoral exam, I guess, doctoral it's called, when the war broke out.
Okay, and I know there are other things that people associate with very sort of Dutch traditions, like bike riding. And I know this was not one of your favorite pastimes or modes of transportation either.
I was excellent in hitting things. I felt it was very natural when you sit on a bike and you look at something to go right at it. And I hit flowers on the roadside and stuff like that. So I gave it up.
Mm-hmm.
I had no major accidents, only caused some.
And also sports, like what were the big sports activities that were very popular?
One sad thing is that there were several things I wanted to do that my parents didn't allow me. I wanted one of those things with 2 handles to test your strength, but they felt I was too weak to do that. And I wanted a canoe, and she said I couldn't swim well enough. So I didn't do any of those things. I did some tennis, especially on vacations in Switzerland. You often went to Switzerland on summer vacation. And table tennis, ping pong, I still love.
I remember that. Well, did you want to, is this a natural point to switch over to?
I went to Utrecht, and now you go on from Beurs to Utrecht.
Yeah.
My parents, well, I was born in Indonesia, and my parents, they were both teachers. My father was a very ambitious person, and he discovered that he could not make much promotion if he stuck with teaching the Dutch children in the Dutch schools, because there was a lot of competition. So he decided to really learn the Indonesian language so he could become an inspector. And this went on all through my childhood, and every time he went up in his position, we had to move. So we moved every 2 years. And the result was that I never spent more than a year and a half in a school. I think I went to 4 elementary schools and 3 high schools. It was difficult to make friends that way. And but I was used to it, and I didn't think it was anything special. And my father was a government worker, and government workers got sabbaticals. And during a sabbatical, they got a paid trip to Holland, to the mother country, as it was called. So during my youth we went twice, and we went on a big ship, and it lasted a month to go from Indonesia to Holland. And the first time it was not at all pleasant because everything was cold and I had colds and things like that. But the second time it was much more pleasant. And
But Dutch was your first language, and
Dutch was, well,
and your
Dutch-
parents also, was that their first language?
No, or,
Yeah. The first language.
Your parents.
yes, of course, it was, you know, Dutch was the official language, at least for the people who were not Indonesian.
Mm-hmm.
And if an Indonesian child knew Dutch, they could go to the Dutch school if they could afford it. Because while in Holland the schools were free, in Indonesian they were not. They had to pay, tuition. When I had finished my last exam, and I was ready to go to study, my parents decided to send us to Holland. My brother was a year ahead of me, and he was going to going to medical school in Jakarta.
So he had already started medical school,
Yes,
at that
he
point, and that's
did.
your brother Ed?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the problem was they were extremely strict, and at the end of the first year they told him he couldn't continue. So and my father had given me two choices: either become a engineer, no, how do you call it?
Yeah.
An engineer, or become a doctor. And I wanted really to study language, but I didn't know Latin, and in Holland it was necessary to know Latin and Greek before you could take a language.
Was it unusual for young girls to be expected to follow that type of a professional career at that time in
Well,
Indonesia?
it was not very common, but it was certainly not unusual, because the opportunities in Indonesia were very small, and so basically you had to go to Holland to do that. So my mother and my two brothers and we went to Holland, and we both enrolled in medical school, or at least it is not really called medical school, it's the medical faculty of the university. And my younger brother still had to go to high school.
And how old were you when you moved
I
to
was
Holland?
17.
17?
And my father stayed back because he wasn't ready to be pensioned yet. So he was in Indonesia and we were in Holland. And we went to Utrecht because the previous times we had been in Amsterdam, and Amsterdam was entirely too much a city for us. And Utrecht was surrounded by some woods and heather, and it was much more country-like. So, and I wanted to get to know people, and I wanted to become a member of a student organization. And you had really two to choose from. One was exclusively for women, and one was a co-educational one. And I really wanted to go to a co-educational one. And a friend, the son of a colleague of my father, said, "Go to Unitas, that's a good organization." And he was a member, and so I did. And in the beginning when you came, there was a period of, I think, 2 or 3 weeks where you were more or less on,
It's a mild hazing.
well, it was not hazing.
No.
It was, well, we had to address all the elderly, I mean the
Older.
Yeah.
students with Mr. and Mrs. So I addressed Leo as Mr. of course. And
No, we're not that far yet.
but well, it was basically a time to get to know for the elderly, for the well.
More
Really?
senior?
Shall I talk about the
Oh,
no.
dinner?
Well, can
not,
I-
Not yet. Well, the older students got to know the new ones, and we had little books, and if they approved of us, they gave us their signature. And I don't know how many you had to have. but-
64.
Well, anyway, and so you got to know your other fellow novices, which is what they were called.
Well, this student group, was it restricted to people who were students who were also in medical faculty or in sciences, or was it
Didn't make any difference
Any-
because
It's theology too.
Mhm.
the university did not have a medical school, they had a medical faculty.
And
they
could
had
you define that a little bit, how that's different from what a medical school is here?
a medical school here. Well,
Did you take it?
yeah. It's probably a little bit